On a Tuesday morning in July of 1994, Diana Holt stood at the edge of a construction site in Callaway County, Missouri, and stared at the one thing in her life that refused to move. The stump was enormous. It sat in the middle of what was supposed to become the entrance road to Ridgeline Estates, her company's most ambitious project to date. The oak tree it had belonged to was long gone, cut down, and hauled away weeks earlier by a professional crew with specialized saws and a chipper the size of a school bus. The tree itself had been 300 years old. Its trunk had measured 8 feet across at the base. Its canopy had spread so wide that standing beneath it felt like standing inside a cathedral. But the tree was gone now. All that remained was the stump. And the stump Diana was beginning to understand was a different problem entirely. The root system spread 40 feet in every direction. Near the center, the roots were as thick as telephone poles, twisted and iron hard from 3 centuries of growth. Further out, they branched and rebranched into thousands of smaller tendrils that had wound themselves through Missouri clay the way fingers wind through hair, deep, patient, relentless. This tree had been growing since before the American Revolution. It had watched the Harrison family clear this land, plow it, plant it, and harvest it for 150 years. It had watched them grow old and pass the land to their children, who had passed it to their children, who had finally sold it to a developer from the county seat who thought she knew exactly what she was doing. Diana Holt was 42 years old. She had been building things in central Missouri since she was 23, first as a project manager under her father's watch, then as a site supervisor, then as a partner, and finally 2 years ago as the sole owner of Holt Construction, the company Roy Holt had built from nothing over 30 years. Roy had died of a heart attack in the spring of 1992. He had been sitting at his desk reviewing blueprints when it happened. His coffee was still warm when they found him. Diana had been running the company ever since, and for 2 years, she had been doing something she hadn't quite expected. She had been proving herself. Not to the clients cared about timelines and budgets, and Diana had never missed either. Not to the banks, her credit was perfect, her financials immaculate. She had been proving herself to the industry itself, to the network of contractors and suppliers and county officials and competing builders who had watched Roy Holt build his empire and were now quietly, constantly measuring his daughter against the memory of him. She drove a dark blue truck rather than a Mercedes because she had learned early that the industry respected restraint in a woman the way it never required it from a man. She wore steel-toed boots and field khakis to every site visit because she had learned that the men who worked for her paid attention to what she wore in a way they never would have paid attention to what her father wore. She kept her voice level in every meeting, every disagreement, every moment of crisis because she had learned that the word people reached for when a woman raised her voice was never the same word they reached for when a man did. She had learned all of this the hard way. And she had built Holt Construction into the largest residential contractor in Callaway County without losing a single major contract, without going over budget on a single major project, and without ever, not once in 2 years, letting anyone see her doubt herself. Ridgeline Estates was supposed to be the proof. 50 luxury homes on 5-acre lots, starting at $500,000 each. A gated community with a private lake, tennis courts, a clubhouse designed by an architect out of St. Louis. The kind of development that didn't just make money, it made a name. Roy Holt had talked about a project like this for years, had sketched ideas on napkins at the dinner table when Diana was still in high school. He had never quite gotten there. Diana had gotten there. The entrance road was the first thing buyers would see. It curved through a stand of mature oaks in a long, graceful arc that led the eye toward the gatehouse and beyond it toward the lake. The design was deliberate. Diana had spent weeks with the landscape architect refining the angle, the grade, the spacing of the trees that would line the road on both sides. She wanted the entrance to feel like arriving somewhere. She wanted the buyers, the doctors and lawyers and executives and retired business owners who would spend $500,000 on a home to feel the moment they turned off the county road that they had arrived somewhere worthy of them. The stump sat directly in the path of that entrance, right where the road needed to go. The tree itself had been easy enough to remove. Professional crew specialized equipment, 2 days of work, and the 300-year-old oak had come down without incident. Diana had watched from the edge of the site, and she had felt something she hadn't expected, a small, private sadness, not guilt exactly. The tree had needed to come down. The project required it, the contracts required it, the timeline required it. But she had stood there watching 3 centuries of living wood reduced to a pile of logs in 2 days, and she had felt the weight of it somewhere beneath the project manager part of her brain. Then the tree was gone, and the stump remained, and Diana had told her crew the same thing she told herself: in moments like this, we'll handle it. We have the equipment. Give me the weekend. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now the machine that was supposed to handle it sat 30 feet from the stump, with hydraulic fluid drying brown on its yellow paint, and 3 burst hoses coiled in a pile near the tracks. The Caterpillar 350 excavator was Diana's newest piece of equipment. She had purchased it 6 months earlier, financed over 7 years, at a payment that made her accountant wince. 40 tons of steel and hydraulics capable of digging a swimming pool in a single day. The machine represented something: the scale of her ambitions, the seriousness of her intentions, the size of the company she intended to build. She had driven it herself for this job. That had been the first mistake, and she knew it. Diana was a competent equipment operator. Roy had made sure of that, had put her in the seat of every machine in the yard before she was 20. But she was not a specialist. And pulling a 300-year-old stump from Missouri clay required a kind of precision and patience that Diana, in the pressure of deadlines and the weight of watching eyes, had not brought to the task. She had wrapped the bucket around the base of the stump. She had engaged the hydraulics and pushed the machine to its limits. The first hose had blown 40 minutes in a sound like a rifle shot that sent the crew scattering backward and left Diana sitting in the cab with hydraulic fluid on her arms and her face hot with something she refused to call embarrassment. They had replaced the hose. They had tried again. The second hose had blown 2 hours later. They had brought in the company bulldozer to push from behind while the excavator pulled from the front. The bulldozer's tracks had spun uselessly on the clay. The third hose had blown the following morning. 3 weeks, $30,000 in repairs and equipment downtime. And the stump had not moved. Frank Briggs found her there on that Tuesday morning, standing at the edge of the crater. The excavator had gouged into the earth around the base of the stump, a wound in the ground that accomplished nothing except demonstrating how hard they had tried and how thoroughly they had failed. Frank was 55 years old and had been with Holt Construction for 20 of them, the last 12 as site foreman. He was a broad, quiet man with a gray beard and hands that looked like they had been used to build things since before Diana was born, which they had. Roy Holt had hired him away from a competing contractor after watching Frank solve a foundation problem that 3 engineers had called unsolvable, and he had been the company's institutional memory ever since, the keeper of all the lessons Roy had learned, the hard way passed along in the form of 3-word warnings and long silences, and the particular way he had of looking at a problem before he said anything at all. He looked at the stump now the same way. A long silence. Then he said, "Buyers close in October." "I know when the buyers close, Frank." "September for the entrance road. That's in the contract." "I know what's in the contract." Another silence. Frank picked up a piece of dried clay from the ground and turned it over in his hand the way he sometimes did when he was working out how to say something he knew she wasn't going to want to hear. Diana had learned to pay attention to that gesture. "What?" she said. "I called around while you were in Street Lewis last week. 3 companies that specialize in stump removal. Big operations out of Kansas City and Springfield." Diana looked at him, and Frank set the piece of clay down carefully. They all passed. One of them said they'd come look at it. The other 2 heard the description, 300-year-old white oak root system, 40 feet out Missouri clay, and said no before I finished talking. The site around them was quiet in the particular way that construction sites are never actually quiet. The distant sound of graders working on the far end of the property, the low hum of a compressor running somewhere behind the equipment yard. But here at the stump, it was as still as the inside of a church. "There has to be someone," Diana said. "I'm not done calling, but I wanted you to know where we are." Frank paused. "We're running out of conventional options." He didn't say what else he knew. What he knew was this: there was a man on the property line who had the equipment and the experience to pull that stump, and Frank had thought of him 3 weeks ago when the first hose blew. He hadn't said anything then because he hadn't been certain the man still did this kind of work, and because he'd told himself the excavator would handle it, and because If he was honest with himself in the way he'd learned to be across 20 years of solving other people's problems, he'd wanted Diana to find her own way to the answer rather than be handed it. Roy had always said that the lessons you fought your way to were the only ones that stuck. Frank had believed him then. Standing here now, 3 weeks and $30,000 later, he was less sure he'd read the moment right. What Frank didn't say, what Diana would find out later that day, not from Frank, but from a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear, was that other phone calls had been made on site that had nothing to do with stump removal companies. She had gone back to the site trailer to retrieve some blueprint revisions around 2 in the afternoon. The trailer was small, a temporary office unit parked on the edge of the clearing, and the aluminum walls were thin enough that voices carried clearly from outside when the window was cracked, which it was because July in Missouri made the trailer an oven by midday. She heard her own name first. Then she heard a voice she recognized, one of the senior crew members, a man named Garrett, who had been with the company for 8 years, speaking in the low register menus when they're certain no one important is listening. All I'm saying is Frank's been here long enough. He knows how things work. He could make the call. A second voice, younger, a laborer she'd hired in the spring. What kind of call? The kind that says maybe this particular job needs somebody with more experience handling the equipment side. Somebody who's done this kind of thing before. You mean like a different contractor? I mean like a contractor who doesn't drive a pickup and wear field khakis because she's trying to fit in with us. I mean like somebody Roy would have called. Diana stood very still inside the trailer. The blueprint revisions were in her hand. She was aware of the weight of them, the paper, the precise technical lines that represented her vision for this project, for this entrance road, for this stump that was defeating her. She was aware of the heat in the trailer and the sound of the air conditioner running and losing and the distant graders on the far end of the property. She stood there long enough to hear the younger man say he didn't think that was right, and long enough to hear Garrett say it wasn't about right, it was about results, and long enough to hear Frank's voice enter the conversation from somewhere off to the right, sharp and final, shutting it down in 2 sentences that she didn't quite catch. Then she walked out of the trailer with the blueprints nodded to Frank when she passed him and went back to the stump. She stood there for a long time. This was the truth about the stump, the part that had nothing to do with roots or clay or hydraulic pressure. The stump had become a test, not just a construction problem, a test. The buyers were watching the timeline. The county was watching the project. The industry was watching Diana. And now her own crew was watching her fail and having quiet conversations about what that failure meant and whether someone else should be making the decisions. She could hire outside help. She could bring in a specialist, a demolition firm, a team of engineers with a different approach. She could solve the problem by admitting that she couldn't solve it herself. And every person who had ever doubted whether Roy Holt's daughter was the right person to run Roy Holt's company would nod privately and file it away. The first crack, the first concession, the first proof that the company had been handed to the wrong person. Or she could keep trying, keep throwing expensive equipment at an ancient root system until something gave way, either the stump or her budget or her schedule. Neither option felt like winning. The sound came from the direction of the access road. She heard it before she saw it, in metallic rhythm, slow and heavy, the kind of mechanical sound that belongs to a different era. Not the smooth hum of modern hydraulics or the diesel rumble of current generation equipment. Something older, something that moved through the world at a different pace than everything around it. She turned and she saw the Caterpillar 20 cresting the small rise that separated the Dawson property from the construction site. The machine was the color of rust and time. Its original orange paint had faded over 64 years to something closer to dried clay, a color that matched the Missouri earth in a way that seemed almost intentional. It was small by any modern standard, 8 feet long, perhaps 5 feet wide, and it moved on steel tracks that pressed directly against the ground with a weight and deliberateness that was completely unlike the rubber track machines Diana was used to. There was no cab, no air conditioning, no computer interface. The operator's seat was open to the July sky, and the man sitting in it was 71 years old with a face that had been weathered by decades of outdoor work into something that looked like it had been carved rather than aged. Earl Dawson climbed down from the machine with the careful economy of movement that belongs to men who have learned to protect their joints across a lifetime of physical work. He was tall, or had been once, with shoulders that still carried the memory of strength, even if the years had taken some of it. He wore canvas work pants, a cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and boots that were older than some of Diana's crew members. Behind the crawler, he towed a trailer loaded with chains, pulleys, cables, steel stakes, and wooden blocks. The equipment on that trailer looked like it belonged in the Smithsonian. Some of it probably did. Frank moved to stand near Diana. He had seen the crawler coming and walked over without being asked, which told Diana that Frank had some idea what this was about. Earl Dawson, Frank said quietly, farms the 320 acres on the other side of your north property line. Been there his whole life. I know who he is, Diana said. She did. Every developer in Callaway County knew Earl Dawson the way sailors know a reef is something to navigate around carefully. He had watched the land around his farm get purchased and developed piece by piece over the past decade, and he had never protested, never filed an objection, never joined any of the committees or coalitions that periodically tried to slow construction in the county. He had simply watched, and occasionally he had voted in ways that were quietly consequential. Earl walked toward her with the unhurried gait of a man who has decided something and sees no need to rush its execution. He stopped about 10 feet away and looked at her, then at the stump, then at the excavator with its limp hydraulic arm and the puddle of dried fluid beneath it. Morning, he said. Mr. Dawson, Diana said. This is a closed work site, insurance requirements. I'm your neighbor. He nodded toward the stump. Saw you've been having some trouble. Diana kept her voice level. We have it handled. Earl looked at the excavator again, at the 3 burst hoses at the crater surrounding the stump's base. He looked at it for a long, quiet moment, and his expression didn't change. Then he looked at Diana. I've pulled some stumps, he said. Thought I might be able to help. This was the moment. Diana understood it as it was happening, the way you sometimes understand pivotal moments, not in retrospect, but in the instant itself with full clarity. She could send him away. She had every professional reason to. He was an old farmer with a machine that was older than most of the trees on her property. He had no credentials, no insurance certification for this kind of work, no bond or liability coverage that her lawyers would approve. She could thank him for his time and watch him drive his antique crawler back down the access road and continue trying to solve this problem herself. That was the rational choice, the professional choice. But she didn't move. Not right away, because something in the way Earl Dawson was looking at her patient, measuring without judgment or condescension, reminded her of the way her father used to look at a problem he hadn't solved yet. Roy Holt had believed that most problems were already solved somewhere by someone, and that the main challenge was finding the right person who had solved them and being willing to listen. Thank you for the offer, Diana said carefully. But I don't think your father looked at this land 15 years ago, Earl said. Diana stopped. He came out in the spring of '79, walked the property with a surveyor, spent most of a day out here. Earl paused. He stood right where you're standing. The air on the construction site seemed to grow still. Somewhere behind them, a piece of equipment downshifted with a mechanical groan. He never bought it, Diana said. No, he walked away. Earl looked at the stump. He knew about the stump. The Harrison family had been telling people about it for years. Anyone who looked at that parcel, they'd warn them. 300-year-old white oak right in the middle of the only natural route for an entrance road. Roy Holt knew what it would take to move it, and he decided the project wasn't worth the fight. Diana was quiet for a moment. In the 2 years since her father's death, she had learned things about Roy Holt that she hadn't known when he was alive, the deals he'd passed, on the risks he'd declined, the problems he'd decided were more trouble than they were worth. She had always believed her father was a man who attacked every obstacle. She was learning that he had been something more nuanced than that. He had been a man who chose his battles with great care. She had bought this land without knowing the history. The seller had disclosed the stump, and the paperwork had described it in the dry language of legal documentation as a legacy root mass requiring removal prior to road construction. Diana had read those words and thought Excavator one afternoon handled. She had bought the land her father walked away from, and she was standing in the exact spot he had stood. You knew my father, she said. Some. He came over once after he looked at the property, asked me about the stump, what I thought it would take to move it. I told him. Earl paused. He listened. Then he thanked me and drove away, and I didn't see him again. Heard he died a few years back. I'm sorry for it. Diana looked at Earl Dawson, then at the crawler sitting at the edge of the work area with its engine idling patient as its owner. She looked at the trailer full of chains and pulleys that looked like something out of a history book. She looked at the Stump, immovable ancient, occupying the exact center of her ambition. She wanted to say yes. That surprised her. She had expected to feel resistance, had expected the professional calculation to overwhelm everything else. But she found that she wanted to step back and let this old man and his old machine try what her new machine could not do. And that wanting was the problem. Because if Earl Dawson pulled this stump, if this 71-year-old farmer with a 64-year-old crawler accomplished in an afternoon what her 40-ton excavator had failed to accomplish in 3 weeks, the crew would see it. Frank would see it. The industry would hear about it the way the industry always hears about things, through the particular telephone network of job sites and supply yards and county offices where people talk. And what they would say would not be that Diana Holt was smart enough to accept help when she needed it. What they would say would be what Garrett had said this afternoon in a quiet voice outside a trailer window. The thing that cut deepest, because it was the fear she carried every day and never let herself speak aloud. They would say that this project was beyond her, that Roy would have handled it differently, that his daughter didn't have what it took. So she said, I appreciate the offer, but we have contractors looking at this right now. We're going to handle it. Earl didn't move. He didn't argue. He looked at her with those weathered eyes in a way that made Diana feel for just a moment completely transparent, as if he had looked through the professional composure and the careful voice and the steel-toed boots and seen exactly what was underneath them. Your father walked away from this stump, Earl said. His voice was quiet without accusation. You didn't. He paused. I told him the same thing I'll tell you. The machine doesn't matter. The approach matters. You can spend another month fighting that root system the wrong way, or you can spend an afternoon doing it right. Either way, the stump comes out eventually. The question is, what condition everything else is in when it does? He let that sit there. Then he said, I'll be on my property if you change your mind. I can see this site from my barn. He turned and walked back toward the crawler. He climbed into the open seat, taking his time, each movement deliberate, and engaged the clutch. And the Caterpillar 20 began its slow clanking, turned back toward the access road. Diana watched him go. Frank walked over and stood beside her. He was quiet for a moment, watching the crawler make its way back up the rise. Earl Dawson pulled a stump for the Hendersons over on Route Z about 12 years ago, Frank said. Big one. They'd had 2 other contractors fail. Earl was out there most of a day with that machine and a bunch of chains. Stump came out clean. Why didn't you say that 3 weeks ago? Frank was quiet for a moment. Because I wasn't sure he still did this kind of work. And because I thought the excavator would handle it. He paused and his voice went a shade quieter. And because your father used to say the lessons you fight your way to are the only ones that stick. I thought maybe I was doing you a favor. Another pause. I don't think that anymore. Diana looked at the stump. She looked at the excavator. She thought about her father standing in this exact spot in the spring of 1979, talking to Earl Dawson about root systems and approach, and then getting in his truck and driving away. Roy Holt had chosen his battles with great care. He had been a man who knew the difference between quitting and retreating to fight smarter. Diana was not sure, standing there in the July heat with $30,000 of damage behind her, and a deadline she was running out of room to meet, whether calling Earl Dawson back was the smart move or the defeated one. She was not sure whether it was what her father would have done, or the opposite of what he would have done, or something he had never gotten far enough to figure out. She picked up the radio. Frank, she said, go after him. Earl Dawson heard the radio before Frank Briggs reached him. Not the words, the crawler's engine was too loud for that, and his hearing had not been sharp since his 50s. But he saw Frank coming across the site at something faster than a walk, and he knew before the man opened his mouth what Diana Holt had decided. He had been watching her face for the last 10 minutes the way he watched weather coming across his north field, reading it, measuring it, waiting for the moment it committed to a direction. He cut the engine. Frank stopped beside the crawler and looked up at him. She wants to know if the offer's still open. Earl climbed down. It's still open. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He walked back to the trailer and began checking the chains, running each one through his hands, from end to end, feeling for weak links the way a doctor feels for something wrong beneath the skin. The crew watched him from a distance, gathered in the loose, careful way that people gather when they're not sure whether they're witnessing something important or something foolish. The truth about why Earl Dawson had driven his crawler across the property line that morning was more complicated than it appeared. He had watched Diana Webb throw expensive equipment at the Harrison Oak for 2 weeks. He had watched from his barn with the patience of a man who knew how long it takes for people to exhaust the obvious options. But what had finally driven him across was not pity, and it was not the goodness of his heart. It was the oak itself. That tree had stood on Harrison land for 300 years. His father Walter had known it, his grandfather before that. The Dawsons and the Harrisons had shared a fence line for 4 generations, and that oak had marked the boundary between their properties before any fence existed at all. Watching someone tear at its root system with a hydraulic arm, wrong angle, wrong force, no understanding of how the roots lay felt to Earl, like watching a surgeon operate with a sledgehammer. The tree was coming out regardless. Diana Holt was going to get it one way or another. But the way she was going about it was an insult to the work itself. And Earl Dawson had never been able to abide sloppy work, not in 45 years of farming, not in anyone else's yard, and not in clear sight of his own barn window. He hadn't come to rescue Diana Holt. He had come because the job deserved to be done right. Diana walked over and stopped about 5 feet from the trailer. She watched Earl work for a moment. Then she said, "What do you need from us?" Earl looked up. The question had surprised him slightly, not its content, but its form. Most people in her position would have asked what he was going to do, or how long it would take, or whether he was sure this was going to work. Diana Holt had asked what she could do to help. Earl filed that away without comment. "Keep your people back 30 feet from the stump while I'm working," he said. "No equipment running nearby, I need to feel the ground. And nobody touches those chains unless I ask them to." "Done," Diana said. She turned to Frank. "You heard him." Frank nodded and moved off to reposition the crew. Earl finished checking the chains and began unloading the rest of the trailer. The block and tackle system came off first, a series of pulleys that looked to anyone who had not seen them in use like antique hardware rescued from a ship that had sunk sometime before the First World War. Each pulley was cast iron heavy, designed to take a load that would have destroyed a modern block in short order. They were not elegant, they were not fast, they were simply the result of someone decades ago understanding exactly how much force needed to be moved through exactly what arrangement of mechanical advantage to accomplish a particular kind of work. Walter Dawson had bought the first set in 1935. Earl had replaced individual components over the years as they wore out. But the core of the system was the same one his father had assembled on this same trailer, a different trailer, then older, pulled by the same crawler, to do the same kind of work on farms across Callaway County for 40 years. Diana watched Earl unload without speaking. After a few minutes, she moved closer. Not to interfere, she stood to the sidearms at her sides, observing. Earl noticed that she was watching the equipment rather than watching him, studying each piece as it came off the trailer with the focused attention of someone trying to understand how it worked. "6 pulleys," she said after a while. Sorry, Earl confirmed. "That multiplies your pulling force by a factor of 6. Earl looked at her. "That's right. Your crawler puts out about 25 horsepower at the drawbar. So through the pulley system, you're applying the equivalent of 150 horsepower. Earl set down the pulley he was holding. "How do you know that?" "I looked up the Cat 20 spec sheet when Frank told me about the Henderson job 12 years ago. She paused. "I looked it up last night, actually. When I saw your crawler on the property line this morning, I thought you might come over." Earl was quiet for a moment. He picked up the pulley again. 150 horsepower is still less than what your excavator produces." "I know," Diana said, "but the application is different." Earl stopped entirely and looked at her with something that might in a less weathered face have been called surprise. "That's right," he said. "That's exactly right. Your system applies force continuously and from multiple angles. The hydraulics apply force in a single direction in bursts. When the burst hits the limit of what the system can handle, either something moves or something breaks. And with root systems like this one," Earl said, watching her, "something breaks." "3 times, Diana said. A silence settled between them that was different from the earlier silences. Not the silence of two people in opposition, but something that felt more like the beginning of a working relationship. Earl looked at the stump, then at the excavator, with its damaged lines, then back at Diana. "Your father understood machines," he said. "I could tell that when I talked to him. You understand them too." "He taught me." Diana looked at the stump. "He just didn't teach me everything." Earl turned back to the trailer. "Nobody's father ever does." He spent the next hour walking the stump, not circling it in a general way, but examining it the way a surgeon examines a body, before opening it systematically from every angle, getting down on one knee at intervals to probe the soil with a steel rod, gauging depth and resistance, mapping the root system by feel and inference, and the accumulated knowledge of having done this specific kind of work more times than he could accurately count. Diana followed him on the first two circuits, watching what he was looking at, trying to read the ground the way he was reading it. On the third circuit, she fell back and let him work. She understood that she had reached the limit of what she could learn by watching, and that the rest of it was in Earl's hands, in his 60 years of experience, and his understanding of this particular kind of problem, which was deeper than anything she could bridge in an hour. On the fourth circuit, Earl stopped at the north side of the stump and crouched down. He pushed the steel rod into the ground and held it there, then pulled it out and looked at what it had brought up. A cylinder of clay, gray and dense. He turned it in his fingers. Then he said without looking up, "My father pulled a stump on this land, summer of '47. Diana walked over. "On the Harrison property. South section. Theodore Harrison's grandfather was splitting the parcel between his two sons. Needed the fence line cleared. Walter, my father, brought this same crawler out. Took him most of a day." Earl set the clay cylinder down carefully on the ground beside him. The stump he pulled was the parent tree. The oak this came from was a seedling that sprouted the same summer. The Harrisons let it grow as the new boundary marker. He looked at the stump beside him, its root mass extending in all directions through the Missouri clay. "My father planted the seed, in a manner of speaking. Seems right that I should be the one to pull what grew from it." Diana looked at the stump with different eyes than she'd been using all morning. She had been looking at it as an obstacle, a thing between her and the road she needed to build. She was looking at it now as a thing with a history connected by a chain of seasons and decisions and human hands that ran back further than her father's involvement with this land and further than the Harrisons' ownership of it. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Earl stood, his knees straightening with the slow determination of a man negotiating with his own body, and walked back toward the trailer. Diana returned to the perimeter. Frank was standing near the equipment shed when she walked back. She didn't go to him. She went to the edge of the cleared area and stood by herself and thought about what Earl had just told her, and about her father, and about the way certain things travel through time in shapes you don't recognize until you're standing in the middle of them. Garrett was at the far edge of the crew, arms crossed, jaw set. He had not looked at Diana since the conversation she'd overheard outside the trailer. She didn't look at him either. When Earl finished his examination, he returned to the trailer and began positioning his equipment with a deliberateness that reminded Diana of watching a chess player lay out an opening, each piece placed with intent, each placement building towards something that wasn't visible yet, but was already fully formed in the mind of the person doing the placing. He drove steel stakes into the ground at 4 points around the stump, each one 30 feet out, positioned at angles that weren't immediately obvious. He ran chains from the stakes through the pulleys and out to specific points on the exposed root mass, not to the stump itself, but to individual roots, each chain angled differently, each point of attachment chosen for a particular purpose. One of the younger crew members drifted closer. "What are all these anchor points for?" Earl didn't look up from the chain he was threading. "The roots on the north side are shallower than the south. I'm going to work the north first. Pop those roots out of the ground individually before I move to the east, then west. South comes last." "Like taking apart a knot," the young man said. "Something like that." Diana heard this and thought about the word she'd used earlier in her own mind, the word approach. Earl wasn't attacking the stump. He was dismantling it. The distinction felt important in a way she hadn't fully articulated yet, but she could feel the shape of it. When the setup was complete, the stump was encircled by a web of chains and cables, each one leading to a different pulley, each pulley positioned to apply force from a different direction. It looked from the outside like an elaborate trap. From the inside, from Earl's perspective, Diana suspected it looked like a map, a precise diagram of the path the stump would travel out of the earth, one root at a time. Earl climbed onto the Caterpillar 20. He let the engine warm up for 4 minutes. Not 3, not 5, 4, exactly the way you do something when you have been doing it for 50 years and have learned through experience what it actually requires. The old engine turned over with a sound that was nothing like modern equipment, not the even power of current diesel technology, but a rougher, more variable rhythm that nonetheless carried a quality of absolute reliability, like an old man's heartbeat that is not smooth but is steady. He engaged the clutch and began to move forward, taking up the slack in the first chain. The chain went taut. The pulleys creaked under the load. The crawler's steel tracks pressed into the Missouri clay with the patient, even weight of a machine that had been doing this since before anyone currently standing on this construction site had been born. For a long moment, nothing visible happened. Diana was watching the north side of the stump, watching the ground around it, the soil surface, the exposed root sections. Frank was 10 feet to her left, also watching. The crew had gone quiet. Then she saw it. A tremor in the clay about 8 feet from the stump's base. A hairline crack appearing in the soil running from the exposed root surface toward the stump itself, the way a crack runs through glass when something beneath it shifts. The root buried 3 feet down was beginning to yield. Earl held the throttle steady. The crawler pulled. The pulleys multiplied. The root resisted. Then with a sound that was nothing like what Diana had expected, not the explosive crack of the blown hydraulic hoses, but something deeper, more fundamental, a resonant snap like a green branch breaking underwater. The first root gave way. The ground over it heaved slightly. A section of clay, the size of a kitchen table, buckled upward an inch, and then settled. And the chain went slightly slack as the load transferred. The crew was completely silent. Frank had his arms at his sides. He was looking at the ground where the root had broken with an expression Diana had not seen on his face before. She would think about that expression later, would turn it over in her mind and try to name it. She settled eventually on reverence not for Earl, not for the machine, but for the thing the machine had demonstrated, that the problem had a solution, that the right approach existed, that 20 years of working construction had not yet exhausted what there was to learn about moving things that didn't want to be moved. Earl disengaged the clutch. He repositioned the chain to the next attachment point on the north side without pausing to acknowledge what had just happened. No celebration, no glance toward the watching crew, no acknowledgement that anything extraordinary had occurred. He simply moved to the next route. Diana pulled her notebook from her jacket pocket. She began writing. Not notes about the timeline or the project or the contract she was writing down the attachment points. Earl had chosen the angles of the pulleys, the sequence he was working in. Writing it the way her father had taught her to write things down on a job site as if the information might save a project someday, because it usually did. Frank moved to stand a few feet away. He watched her write for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Your father used to do that." "Do what?" "Pull out a notebook when somebody else knew something he didn't. People thought he wasn't paying attention. He was paying more attention than anyone in the room." Diana looked down at the notebook in her hands. The handwriting was her own, but the habit was her father's. The same narrow pages, the same dated entries, the same small diagrams in the margins when words weren't enough. She had picked it up without noticing, the way you absorb the habits of people you spend years watching closely. She closed the notebook and looked at the stump. The second root broke 20 minutes after the first, then a third. Earl worked with the same unhurried consistency, repositioning the chains, warming the engine back to operating temperature after each pull, selecting each new attachment point with the deliberate care of someone who had already worked out the entire sequence before the first chain went taut. After the fifth root broke, Garrett uncrossed his arms. Diana noticed. She didn't comment on it, didn't look at him directly, but she noticed. After the seventh, a senior crew member named Douglas walked toward the edge of the work zone and stood quietly for a minute. Then he said, "How is it doing what the excavator couldn't?" Frank said, "It's not doing what the excavator tried to do. That's the point." Douglas thought about this. The excavator tried to pull the whole thing at once. Right. And that's like, Douglas paused, working through it. That's like trying to carry a table by grabbing the middle of it. Frank looked at him with genuine appreciation. That's exactly what it's like. By the time Earl had worked his way around to the east side of the stump, Diana was standing at the edge of the work zone, 10 feet from the stump itself, watching the ground tilt and shift as each root released. The stump had moved, not dramatically, not the sudden, violent displacement she'd been trying to force with the excavator, but unmistakably it was tilted now at 15 degrees from vertical, leaning slightly toward the north, where the shallower roots had been cleared first. It was moving. She called out across the site, "Earl." He cut the engine. She walked to the edge of the cleared area, close enough to speak without raising her voice. "The roots on the south side, that's where the root system goes deepest. I could see it on the GPR survey we did before breaking ground." She paused. 15 feet minimum. Probably more. Earl looked at her. "Closer to 18 from what I can feel. There are 3 main poles down there. They're what's going to take the most work. I can reposition the excavator as a static anchor on the south side," Diana said. "If it's not providing hydraulic force, if we're just using its weight as a counterweight to help your pulley system, it won't blow any hoses. It'll just be 40 tons of steel sitting between your crawler and the load." Earl considered this the way he considered everything without rushing it, letting the idea settle before responding. "The angle would need to be right. I know, I'd want your approval on the placement before we move it." Another pause. Longer. Diana held it, let it be. "All right," Earl said. "Show me where you're thinking." They spent 20 minutes working out the geometry together. Diana sketched angles in her notebook. Earl pointed to where the deep roots would resist and from which direction the counterforce would be most useful. Frank moved the excavator, not running it, just repositioning it on its tracks to the spot they'd agreed on, and Earl walked around the new configuration 3 times before he was satisfied. It was the first time Diana had contributed something technical to the process. Not management, not oversight, not the authority of ownership, an actual technical contribution based on data from the ground-penetrating radar surveys she'd had done before breaking ground, data that Earl didn't have access to and genuinely needed. Earl didn't thank her. He turned back to his crawler, which was more than thanks. Diana was standing 6 feet from the stump when the 8th root broke. She felt the ground move under her boots. Not dangerously, there was no sudden shift, no collapse. Just a ripple through the clay, a transmission of force that had traveled from deep underground, up through 40 feet of root system, and out through the soil surface and into the soles of her feet. She had felt the tree, or what remained of it. The root system, the underground presence of 300 years of growth pressing back against the force that was trying to displace it. 3 centuries of stubborn, patient insistence that this ground was occupied. She thought about the Harrison family, about the inscription she had seen in the property records, the land farmed from 1847 to 1994, the family that had planted crops around this tree for 5 generations, that had watched it grow from something a man could wrap his arms around to something that required equipment to remove. She thought about Walter Dawson driving this same crawler across this same land in the summer of 1947, pulling the parent tree out of the ground while a seedling grew nearby in the July heat. She thought about Roy Holt walking this property in 1979, talking to Earl Dawson about root systems and approach, and then deciding the problem was more than the project was worth. She thought about what Earl had said. "Your father walked away from this stump. You didn't." Frank came and stood nearby. He had been watching her face with the attention of a man who had known her family for 2 decades and had learned to read the Holts the way other people read weather, not the surface but the pressure systems beneath it. "Roy would have liked watching this," Frank said quietly. "He loved finding out he'd been wrong about something. Said it meant there was still something to learn." Diana looked at the stump, now tilted at nearly 20 degrees, its grip on the earth reduced to the deep south side roots and the 3 main poles Earl had identified. "He should have bought this land," she said. "It was a good parcel." He knew that. He let the stump stop him. Frank was quiet for a moment. He was carrying a lot of other projects. He might have come back to it. He didn't. "No," Frank said. He didn't. There was no criticism in either of their voices. Just the plain assessment of a man who had been good at his work and had made one particular calculation that his daughter had made differently. Diana had not bought this land because she was braver than her father or more capable or more stubborn. She had bought it because she hadn't known the full history of the problem. She had walked into the stump without knowing what she was walking into. And then she had refused to walk away. Earl climbed down from the crawler and walked to the trailer. He came back carrying the final chain heavier than all the others, the links the size of a man's fist, the kind of hardware that existed for one purpose and communicated that purpose in its weight alone. He wrapped it around the center mass of the stump above the remaining root system and ran it through the final pulley arrangement, a single block attached to the static excavator on the south side, redirecting the crawler's pull from behind the stump rather than beside it. Diana watched him work and said nothing. She understood now that the silence around Earl Dawson was not the silence of exclusion. It was the silence of concentration, the working quiet of someone doing something that requires all of their attention and has no room for conversation. She had worked in that kind of silence herself. She recognized it. Earl connected the final chain to the crawler's drawbar hook, then walked the entire length of it from the crawler to the pulley to the stump, checking each connection point by hand. He checked them twice. He looked at the stump one final time, studying the remaining roots, the angle of the lean, the position of the deep south side poles relative to the surface cracks that had appeared in the surrounding clay. He looked at Diana. She met his eyes. He nodded once. She took 2 steps back. Earl settled into the open seat of the Caterpillar 20. He let the engine find its rhythm. He looked at the chain, the pulleys, the stump, the excavator, sitting static on the south side like an anchor dropped in clay. He pushed the throttle forward. The crawler's tracks dug into the Missouri earth. The engine changed pitch, not louder exactly, but deeper. More committed, the sound of a machine giving everything it had to a load that required everything it had. The chain went tight as a piano wire, thrumming with the kind of tension that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. The stump groaned, not the mechanical groan of metal under stress, a deeper sound, something organic, the sound of wood and root fiber, and 3 centuries of growth being asked to relinquish what they had spent 3 centuries building. Diana's boots were planted on the clay. She felt the ground move. Then the stump gave way. The sound came from underground, first a deep tectonic release that traveled up through the clay and into her legs before it reached her ears. Then the surface broke. The ground around the south side buckled and split along lines that had been forming for the last 4 hours, stress fractures in the clay that Earl had been engineering toward, with every chain, every pulley, every carefully sequenced root broken loose before this final pull. The stump rose. Not quickly, not the violent explosive displacement Diana had been trying to force with the excavator. This was slower than that and more complete. A steady, inexorable lifting, like something being born from the earth rather than ripped from it. The root system came up with it. All 40 feet of it, the deep south side poles releasing one after another, as the combined force of the crawler and the pulley system exceeded root by root what 3 centuries of growth had anchored into the Missouri clay. Dirt cascaded from the root mass in sheets. Rocks embedded in the root system for decades dropped into the hole below. The smell hit the site all at once, deep earth mineral and cold. The smell of ground that has not been open to the air since before anyone living had drawn a breath. The stump rolled onto its side. The hole it left behind was enormous, 15 feet across at the surface, narrowing as it went down. Diana walked to the edge of it and looked in. The sides were smooth, where the roots had pressed against the clay for centuries, polished, almost the impressions of individual roots, still visible in the walls like the negative space of something that had been present so long it had shaped everything around it. The construction site was completely silent. Then someone started clapping. Diana didn't look to see who it was. The clapping spread irregular at first, then more sustained, and someone let out a long breath that ended in a low sound of disbelief, and Douglas said something to the man beside him, and Frank stood at the edge of the hole with his hands at his sides and his face turned toward the tree line away from the crew. Earl cut the engine. He climbed down from the Caterpillar, 20 descending, with the slow deliberateness of a man who has spent his joints carefully all day and intends to finish the job the same way. He walked to the hole and stood at its edge for a moment, looking down into it. His expression had not changed from the expression he had worn all day, focused inward, the face of a man who is still working, even when the visible work is done. He bent down and picked up a chunk of clay from the edge of the hole. He turned it over in his hands, looking at something on its surface. Then he set it down carefully, not dropping it, not discarding it, but placing it as if it had a right to be returned gently to the ground it had come from. Diana walked over to him. "There's your road," Earl said. He was looking at the hole, not at her. "Yes," Diana said. "There is." She looked at the chunk of clay he had set down. On its surface, pressed into the gray Missouri clay, like a signature, was the impression of a root the width of her fist. The clay had taken the shape of the root so precisely that the individual striations of the wood grain were visible, transferred from living wood to inert earth across decades of sustained pressure. The ground remembered the shape of a thing that was no longer there. "Mr. Dawson," she said, "name your price." Earl shook his head without turning. "I didn't do this for money." "Then name what you want. There has to be something." He was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the crew was beginning to move again. Frank directing people back to their stations, Douglas organizing the equipment, repositioning that would need to happen before they could begin grading the roadbed. The site was returning to its normal register of activity, but quieter than usual, as if the men were working inside some collective awareness that something had happened here that they hadn't fully processed yet. "This land was the Harrison place," Earl said. 147 years they farmed it. My father knew 3 generations of them. My father's father knew the one before that." He turned and looked at Diana. "The Harrisons are gone now. Theodore Harrison was the 5th generation. No children. When he signed the sale papers, that was the end of it." Earl looked at the hole. "But they were here. They built something here. And in a few years, nobody who buys one of your houses is going to know that. They'll drive through your gate and look at your lake, and they won't have any idea what stood here before them." Diana already knew what he was going to say. She had known it since he mentioned the Harrison family had felt the shape of the request forming before he spoke it, the way you sometimes hear the resolution of a chord before it lands. "Put up a marker," Earl said. "Stone, at the entrance where the stump was. Something that tells people this land was farmed for 147 years before it became a subdivision. Something that says the Harrisons were here." Diana said, "I'll do that. I don't want it to be small. I don't want it to be a plaque somebody nails to a post and forgets about. I want it to be something a person has to stop and read." "I'll have a stonemason cut it," Diana said. "I'll write the inscription myself." Earl looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and turned and walked back toward the crawler to begin coiling his chains. Frank fell into step beside Diana as she moved back toward the site trailer. He had a thing he wanted to say, and she could tell he was choosing the moment for it, the way he chose everything with care. "Garrett found me about an hour ago," he said without looking at her. "While you were watching Earl work the east side. He wanted me to know he'd been talking about finding different management for this job. He wanted me to tell you he was wrong." Diana looked at the hole where the stump had been, at the shape of it, the precise dimensions of something that was no longer present. "Tell him I heard him," she said, "both times." Ridgeline Estates was completed in the spring of 1995. 22 weeks after Earl Dawson's Caterpillar 20 pulled the Harrison oak from its hole, Diana Holt stood at the finished entrance road and watched the first buyers drive through the new gate toward the lake. The entrance curved exactly as she had designed it, graceful, deliberate, the kind of approach that made arriving feel like it meant something. At the entrance, set back from the road on a slight rise so that it could be seen from both directions, stood the marker. It was cut from Missouri limestone, 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, set into a base of smaller stones that anchored it to the ground with the permanence of something built to outlast the person who built it. Diana had written the inscription herself over 3 evenings at her kitchen table, discarding draft after draft until she found the words that said what she actually meant. This ground was farmed by the Harrison family from 1847 to 1994. 5 generations broke it, planted it, and passed it forward. Before the houses were built, there were fields. Before the lawns were planted, there were crops. The people who worked this land did not build for themselves. They built for whoever came after. "We are whoever came after." The Homeowners Association raised objections within the month. The marker wasn't part of the aesthetic vision, they said. It made the entrance feel somber. It should be relocated or reduced or removed. Diana attended that meeting herself. She sat through every objection with the level expression she had cultivated across 20 years of rooms where people underestimated her. And when the last voice finished, she stood up and said in a tone that required no elevation to carry, "The marker is a deed restriction. It runs with the property in perpetuity. If you bought a home in this community, you bought it with the marker and part of the package. If anyone wants to challenge that in court, I have good lawyers and a great deal of patience. The meeting ended. The marker stayed. She drove out to the Dawson farm that evening and found Earl on his porch. She told him what had happened. He listened without comment. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Roy would have done the same thing." "I don't know if he would have," Diana said. Earl looked at her. "I do." She visited the farm twice more that fall and 3 times the following year, and after that it became a pattern not frequent enough to be a scheduled appointment, but regular enough that Earl kept a second chair on the porch for when she came. They talked about the county, about construction, about the way the land was changing around them. Earl talked about farming with a matter-of-factness that Diana found clarifying the way plain speech always clarifies after too much time spent in rooms where people talk around things. He told her about Walter Dawson, about the Caterpillar 20 bought used in 1932 for $800, 2 years old at purchase, built in 1930, which had been the largest purchase of Walter's life and the one he had never regretted. About the way Walter had pulled stumps for neighboring farms during the Depression, sometimes for cash and sometimes for food and sometimes for nothing because the neighbors needed it done and Walter had the equipment and the knowledge to do it right. "What made the machine special?" Diana asked once on an October evening when the first frost had silvered the cut stubble in the north field. Earl looked out across the field for a moment. "Nothing special about the machine," he said. "It's a simple piece of iron that does simple things. No computer to override you. No sensor to tell you when to stop." He paused. "What made it work was the thinking that went into using it right." She carried that with her. Not as a philosophy, not as a motto. She was not someone who reduced hard lessons to wall decorations. She carried it as a habit of mind, a reflexive question she began asking in the moment before she committed to any approach, not whether she had enough force, but whether she was applying force correctly. It changed the way she ran projects. Not all at once, but consistently over years in the accumulation of small decisions that end up being the actual shape of a career. She hired older contractors. She kept older equipment. She developed a practice on every new project of finding the person who had been doing this work the longest and sitting with them before the planning meetings to ask what they'd seen fail and why. Frank Briggs retired in 2003. At the dinner, Diana said things about him she had never said while they worked together because she had believed incorrectly that Frank already knew them. She made a note to herself afterward about the specific cost of assuming people know what you think of them. Earl Dawson died in September of 2006. He had been 71 when Diana met him, which meant he was 83 when he went, and he had farmed his land and kept the Caterpillar 20 running until the spring of that year when his son Clem had quietly taken over the monthly engine starts because Earl's hands were no longer reliable in cold weather. The funeral was at the Methodist Church in Fulton. Diana drove up from Jefferson City. She sat in the third row and listened to the minister speak about a man the minister had known from boyhood, and to Clem speak about his father with the directness that seemed to run in the Dawson line, no performance of grief, just a plain account of what the man had been and what he had meant. Afterward, Diana found Clem at the reception. He was lean like his father with the same quality of stillness that seemed to be not a personality trait, but something structural, something in the way Dawson men occupied space. She gave him the check and watched his face when he read the amount. $50,000, Clem said. "The stump cost me $30,000 in repairs and delays," Diana said. "Without your father, it would have cost me the project, possibly the company. That check is 12 years late, and it doesn't account for interest. At any rate, that makes sense." Clem looked at the check for a moment. "Particular cause you want this to go to, whatever your father would have chosen." He supported the County Historical Society. Preservation of old farm equipment programs for school children about how things were done before everything got computerized. He used to bring the Cat 20 to their equipment days so kids could see it running. "Send it there," Diana said, with a note that says it came from Earl Dawson's crawler, the machine that taught me to respect old things. Clem folded the check and put it in his jacket pocket. He looked at Diana with the same measuring quality his father had, that way of looking that felt like being read rather than watched. "He mentioned you sometimes," Clem said. Not often, but when something came up, a problem on the farm or something he'd read about a project going sideways, he'd say Diana Holt would have approached that differently. He paused. Coming from him, that was something. Diana drove back to Jefferson City that evening and did not talk about the funeral to anyone. Some things are complete in themselves. She kept building. Holt Construction grew through the late 90s and into the new century, taking on larger commercial projects, expanding into adjacent counties, opening a second office in Columbia. Diana ran it the way she had learned to run things, with the notebook, with the question asked before the commitment made, with the habit of finding whoever had been there the longest and sitting down with them first. She was 63 years old in the spring of 2015 when her daughter called from a construction site on the outskirts of Fulton. Meg Holt was 19, working her first summer in the field with a residential contractor based in Columbia. Diana had arranged it that way, deliberately had told the contractor that her daughter would learn more from 3 months on a job site than from 3 years behind a desk, and that she wanted Meg in the field from the first week. The call came at 11 in the morning. "Mom, there's a situation." Diana set down the quarterly report she'd been reviewing. "Tell me." "There's a stump, big one, century-old elm right in the path of the entrance road. They've had an excavator on it for 3 days. Nothing." Diana was quiet for a moment. "And," she said, "there's a man here. He drove up about an hour ago. He's got this old crawler on a trailer, orange, I mean really old, and chains and pulleys behind it. The site foreman thinks he's wasting everyone's time." Diana set the quarterly report down very carefully on the corner of her desk. "What's his name?" He said Clem Dawson. The room was quiet. The window looked out over the Capitol building and the Missouri River beyond it, wide and gray under April clouds. She had made decisions in this room for 6 years. She had built what she had from the decisions made in rooms like this one, and she was hearing the Caterpillar 20 running in the background of her daughter's call. Not seeing it, just hearing it, that variable, completely reliable rhythm, the sound of an engine built for a different era that had kept running because people who understood what they had refused to let it stop. "Mom, are you there? I'm here. What should I do? The foreman isn't taking this seriously." Diana thought about a construction site in Callaway County in July of 1994, about the distance between knowing you need help and being willing to accept it, about what it costs you and what it gives you back. "Go stand next to the machine," Diana said, "close enough that everyone on that site sees you standing there. Don't explain yourself. Just stand there, next to Clem, next to the crawler, then watch him before he does anything else. Watch how he looks at the stump. That's the part most people miss, what happens before the first chain goes on." A pause, then Meg said, "Okay, put Clem on for a second." There were footsteps, the idle of the Caterpillar, 20 growing slightly closer, and then a voice that carried something of Earl's measured pace in it, a man who speaks when he has something to say. "Ms. Holt, Clem, thank you for going out there. It's what my father would have done." "I know, that's why I'm thanking you." She paused. "What care of my daughter?" "She's already standing next to the machine," Clem said. "She didn't wait for you to tell her." Diana looked out at the Capitol dome and the river and the wide April sky. She thought about Roy Holt at a drafting table with his coffee going cold, sketching something he never got to build. She thought about Earl Dawson placing a chunk of Missouri clay gently at the edge of a hole because it deserved to be set down with care. "Pull it out for her," Diana said, "and make sure she's holding something when it matters. Don't just let her watch." "Understood." She ended the call and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she opened her notebook, narrow, dated in the upper right corner of each page, small diagrams in the margins, and wrote down the date in a single line. Meg on her first stump, Clem Dawson, Cat 20, still working. Clem pulled that elm stump out in 2 hours and 50 minutes. Meg stood beside the machine for the first half hour and watched the way Clem moved around the stump before he touched a single chain, the slow circling the steel rod in the ground, the deliberate mapping of something no one else on that site could see. She watched him select his anchor points. She watched him thread the first chain through the first pulley. She stood close enough that everyone on the site could see her standing there the way her mother had told her to. And when Clem glanced over after the third root broke and saw her watching the attachment point rather than the machine, he nodded once and said, "Come here." He showed her how to set the chain angle for the next pull. He put the hook in her hand and told her where to place it and why, and she placed it where he said, and when the root broke, she felt it in her hands before she heard it with her ears. When it was over, Meg called her mother. He let me set 3 of the anchor chains, she said. Good. A pause. How did you know he was the right person to call? Diana thought about the right answer, which was long, and the true answer, which was shorter. Because his father was the right person once, she said, and some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for someone who remembers why they were built. The Caterpillar 20 is still in the Dawson barn in Callaway County, Missouri. Clem starts it on the first Saturday of every month, the way Earl started it, the way Walter started it before Earl. The engine runs rough for the first 2 minutes and then finds its working rhythm, variable unhurried, belonging to no particular decade, because it has belonged to all of them. At the entrance to Ridgeline Estates, the limestone marker stands on its rise where the Harrison Oak used to be. The subdivision has been occupied for 25 years now. In the mornings, people drive past the marker on their way to work. Some of them have read it so many times they no longer see it. Some of them stop. Some of them show it to their children and try to explain what it means to build something for people who haven't arrived yet. On a Tuesday morning in July of 1994, Diana Holt stood in front of a stump and felt the weight of everything that was expected of her. She had a deadline and a crew and a 40-ton machine that had failed 3 times in a company built on her father's name and her own determination to be worthy of it. She made one phone call. She stepped back. She watched an old man in an old machine do what her expensive equipment could not. And then she walked to the edge of the hole and understood something she had been circling since the day her father died. The ground remembers what stood in it. Long after the thing is gone, long after the people who planted it and the people who tended it and the people who finally pulled it out are gone. The shape of what was there remains in the clay, pressed in permanent, the record of a presence that outlasted the presence itself. You build for whoever comes after. The work is the proof.